You are looking at a battered piece of history. The Winchester's bolt clicks open like a judge's gavel. 3 seconds pass, and the crowd remembers what silence feels like before a shot changes everything. Before we dive in, sound off in the comments. Soldiers, where are you watching from? I love seeing this community scattered across the world. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next mission. The lens doesn't linger on chrome or carbon fiber. It lingers on wood, worn smooth by decades of use. Walter Hargrove, 78 years old, lifts the Model 70 from its case as if he's greeting an old friend. Around him, younger shooters calibrate digital rangefinders, dial Schmidt and Bender scopes, and scroll through ballistic apps. Their rifles gleam under the sun. Precision machines built to turn wind and distance into math. His rifle looks like it belongs in a museum. This is the Coastal Marksman Classic, 36 law enforcement snipers gathered from across the Pacific coast. A festival of precision where training manuals are scripture and technology is worshipped. For the professionals here, every trigger pull could one day mean the difference between a hostage saved or lost. Walt moves like someone who has measured his life in breaths and trigger squeezes. His jacket smells faintly of diesel and jungle dust, the kind that lingers long after combat boots are traded for walking shoes. He slips a photo into his wallet before stepping onto the range, a foxhole frozen in time, a name carved on a plaque, a vow never spoken aloud. His shooting days officially ended decades ago, but habits don't retire. Fundamentals, once etched into the body, remain across the line. Sergeant Marcus Hale shoulders an Accuracy International AXMC 300 Win Mag gleaming like an apex predator. Detective Aisha Patel adjusts the chassis on her Remington 700, a tablet feeding her corrections in real time. These are not hobbyists, they are the sharp edge of law enforcement. Men and women trained to measure chaos in fractions of a second. The opening stage is familiar, 300, 500, 800 yards. Scored by group size and consistency, young teams confirm distances with lasers, feed numbers into apps, whisper holdovers like liturgy. Cameras cut between the shimmer of crosshairs and gulls circling high over Cedar Point, old and new, colliding in one frame. Walt sits quietly in the shade, the Winchester across his knees. More staff than Kane supporting him. People recognize him, the old vet who shows up every year, always watching, never competing. To most, he's part of the scenery. But the rifle on his lap hums with a presence stronger than memory. When Range Master Elena Santos raises her hand to start the first round, no one expects history to change. The shooters tighten their grips, optics flare under the sun, and shots crack across the range. But beyond the scoreboards, a console flickers, a technician frowns. A murmur spreads through the crowd, the kind that can turn certainty into doubt, and routine into something no one rehearsed. The range had fallen into uneasy silence after the electronic target system shorted out. Without the cameras and digital scoring screens, the entire match seemed at risk of cancellation. Competitors shifted, murmuring frustrations about hours of preparation wasted. For men and women who lived by routine and precision, chaos was the last thing they expected. At the judges' table, Captain Elena Santos conferred with the range officials. The rules had always been clear. This was a sanctioned event for sworn officers only. But now those rules were useless if the targets couldn't be scored at long range. Finally, she stood and addressed the restless crowd. Emergency clause applies. Unknown distance iron sight round. We will continue the classic old school. A ripple of disbelief moved through the competitors. Most had never trained beyond their optics. Laser rangefinders, ballistic calculators, night vision reticles, those were their comfort zones. Iron sights, that was museum work. And then a voice from the back, steady. Gravel-edged. I'll shoot. Heads turned as Walter Hargrove stepped forward, cradling a rifle with the patina of half a century. The Winchester Model 70 looked like it belonged in a display case, its walnut stock worn smooth, its iron sights gleaming faintly under the afternoon sun. Some of the younger officers scoffed. "This isn't a history lesson." "Old man." But Santos raised her hand. "The rules allow an exhibition run if Mr. Hargrove volunteers. We honor it." She scanned the field. Unless any competitor objects, no one spoke. Pride bristled, but no one wanted to be the one to deny him. Walt eased into position, every movement deliberate. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate, just set the butt of the rifle against his shoulder like it had always belonged there. The crowd shifted closer, torn between doubt and curiosity. One officer whispered, "He's nearly 80. How's he supposed to hit steel we can barely find with scopes?" Another muttered, "Watch, you'll see." Walt's eyes traced the landscape, the rolling scrub hills, the heat mirages trembling above the dirt. He wasn't calculating with numbers, he was reading it, the way others read a map. The wind tugged at his shirt sleeve, and he adjusted a fraction. His breathing slowed, shoulders rising and falling like a tide, against rifles worth more than his truck. Walt brought only wood, steel, and memory. When the range officer called shooter ready, Walt gave a single nod. The line of competitors went quiet, their disbelief giving way to something harder to admit: anticipation. The Winchester barked, and the echo rolled across the range. Spotters lifted binoculars, jaws tightening. Walt didn't look to them for confirmation. He already knew where the shot had landed, and in that moment, the competition changed. The targets had been repainted into bold white squares, larger than regulation, so the scorers could at least confirm hits through old-fashioned spotting scopes. The sun had burned away the last morning haze, leaving the air unusually clear. For most shooters, those conditions were nothing more than a footnote. For Walt, they were an open invitation. He studied the field without a scope, just his eyes, the lay of the land, the restless tug of wind through the scrub. Where others saw mirage and distortion, he saw patterns, tiny signatures of air currents, the shimmer that betrayed heat crawling off stone. Younger officers lined the benches behind him, shifting uncomfortably. They were used to dialing numbers into devices, not listening to silence. One of them, Detective Kim, caught himself thinking, could I even do this without glass, or have I trusted the gear too much? Walt adjusted his stance, settling the Winchester into the groove of his shoulder. He didn't rush. Every action was deliberate, born from habits older than the men watching him. The iron sight cut a narrow window, demanding trust in fundamentals. He let the world narrow until only the front post, the distant square, and his heartbeat existed. The shot cracked, flat and honest. Spotters called. Impact low right edge. The steel rang a half-second later. Murmurs rippled. A hit at that distance. With no optics. Wasn't supposed to happen. Walt didn't smile. He just chambered the next round. The second shot came quicker. This time the clang echoed louder. Center mass. A few of the younger competitors leaned forward, elbows on knees. Doubt had crept in, not about Walt, but about themselves. How much of their identity as marksmen relied on batteries and glass. The third shot landed with authority, punching steel again. 3 for 3. The murmurs died, replaced by something weightier. Santos, arms folded, spoke just above a whisper. That's not luck. That's training the rest of us forgot to keep. Walt eased the rifle down, taking a slow breath. He hadn't beaten anyone yet. The course wasn't over. But the field had shifted. The professionals with custom rifles and $1,000 optics were no longer measuring themselves against each other. They were measuring themselves against a 78-year-old Marine who read the wind like scripture, and some of them didn't like what the answer might be. By late afternoon, the air had cooled just enough for the mirages to thin, turning the range into a gallery of hard distances. The next bank of targets stood farther still, stretching out toward the horizon 600, then 700 yards. Normally, competitors relied on magnified reticles and calculators to tame those shots. Now it was just iron sights, clear light, and nerve. Walt settled into prone, the Winchester cradled as if it were bone of his own shoulder. He tilted his head slightly, reading the breeze by the dance of dust devils along the ridge line. Years in the jungle, years on ranch land back home, had carved the same reflex, read the invisible before it reads you. "Shooter, ready," the range officer called. Walt gave a single nod. The crack rolled across the canyon, and a heartbeat later the spotter shouted, "Impact 700 yards." Center steel. This time the reaction wasn't disbelief. It was a shift. Competitors who had mocked him earlier found their fingers drumming nervously on their own rifles. One young sergeant muttered to no one, "I've never even tried iron sights past 300. Another officer, arms folded, stared at Walt with narrowed eyes. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if all the gear he trusted had made him sharper or weaker. Walt cycled the bolt with steady rhythm. Second shot, another ring of steel. Third shot, again. The sequence was merciless. Every clang hammered home a truth the younger men didn't want to face. They weren't just competing against an old man. They were competing against time itself. Decades of skill honed long before their gadgets existed. The gallery behind the line had grown restless. It wasn't noisy. It was tense, as if the weight of history itself pressed against their chests. Some whispered about luck, others about impossible eyesight, but most just stared, knowing they were watching something rawer than competition. By the time Walt cleared the last target at 800 yards, the air felt different. Not silent charged. The professionals weren't shocked anymore. They were unsettled, forced to ask whether the shortcuts of modern training had dulled the very instincts that once defined a marksman. Walt sat back slowly, exhaling, as if he'd simply finished a chore that needed doing. He didn't raise his rifle in triumph. He didn't need to. The look on the younger shooters' faces said everything. And the next target bank loomed even farther out. The final target stood nearly 900 yards away, a slab of white steel catching the last light of the day. The younger officers knew the number by heart. At that distance, even with scopes and ballistic computers, error margins grew brutal. Without them, it bordered on myth. Walt lay flat, cheek pressed to the worn walnut stock, the rifle an extension of muscle memory carved over half a century. The crowd leaned in, breaths tight, waiting for him to fail, for the spell to break. He didn't rush. He let the sun settle low, painting the range in clear contrast. The target had been cut larger for visibility, and the air had gone strangely still. Those advantages meant little to most, but to a man who'd once judged wind by the sway of jungle leaves, they were enough. Shooter ready, Walt gave his nod. The Winchester barked, recoil thudding into his shoulder. The half-second stretched, then the steel rang faint but undeniable. A clean hit. For a moment, there was no cheer, no gasp, just the raw sound of history echoing off canyon walls. Then the line erupted not in wild applause, but in something heavier, respect. Competitors who'd smirked earlier now stood quietly, helmets in their hands. Some looked at their rifles as if questioning the very tools that defined them. Captain Santos let her clipboard fall to her side, shaking her head with a small smile. exhibition or not. That was a masterclass. Walt pushed himself up slowly, joints protesting, but his eyes clear. He didn't lift his rifle overhead, didn't wave to the crowd. Instead, he leaned on the Winchester like an old walking stick and offered a simple nod to the line of officers. "You don't always need more glass or more tech," he said, voice steady. "Sometimes all you need is to trust the fundamentals and trust yourself." It wasn't bravado, it was a reminder, and it landed harder than any hit on steel. By the time the sun dipped fully below the ridge, the Coastal Marksman Classic had crowned its champions on paper, but the only name anyone carried home that night wasn't on a score sheet. It was Walter Hargrove, 78 years old, who showed that skill doesn't age and memory doesn't rust. And in the quiet afterward, more than one young sniper resolved to dust off their iron sights before the next season.